Good afternoon. I'm Michael Lindsay. On behalf of all my colleagues, let me welcome you to this very special gathering, a capacity crowd. We have folks, we do have 3 seats here on the very front row where you'll get a chance to be close to Matt Milliner, so we invite folks to come and be his groupies. I'm sure Matt would appreciate that very much. Today's lecture, the Walter and Darlene Hansen lecture, gives us an opportunity to pay tribute to 2 individuals who have been wonderful patrons and supporter of the arts at Gordon and at Westmont and Wheaton and a variety of other places. So we are very deeply honored to have Walter and Darlene joining us from Chicago, and also very grateful for 2 couples who made it possible for us to have this special gathering. I want to recognize Stan and Judy Gady, our colleagues here on the Gordon campus, who also have formed a deep friendship with Steve and Denise Adams. And we're very grateful to have all 6 of you here for this special gathering. And I hope that it lives up to being as meaningful as we were hoping and dreaming this time last year. So thank you all for being here with us. I'll now invite my colleague, Dr. Tal Howard, who serves as the director for the Center for Faith and Inquiry, to kick off our gathering. So Tal.
I say this is quite a crowd. Don't be surprised if a paralytic is let down in the center of the roof after a while. But greetings, and let me echo the sentiments of President Lindsay to the funders and the namesakes of this lecture. It's an honor to inaugurate it. One of the great pleasures of making introductions is learning about fields that you don't know that much about or you want to learn more. And the 2 relevant ones today are theology and art history. I think as the saying goes, I know just enough about theology to be dangerous and art history to be lethal. But fortunately, this is not true of our speaker today, Dr. Matt Milliner, who teaches art history at Wheaton College. He did his undergraduate work also at Wheaton, and that prepared him to go on to do not 1 but 3 advanced degrees at Princeton University. He did his Master's of Divinity, followed by a master's in medieval and Byzantine art history, and followed that by a PhD, also in medieval and Byzantine art. His dissertation was entitled The Virgin of the Passion, Development, Dissemination, and Afterlife of a Byzantine Icon Type. In all his work, he's especially interested in the topic of how art functions as visual theology, both in the past and in the contemporary world. And I'm trained as a historian of more of the modern period, but over lunch today and in chatting with him, our mutual interest in having, you can only really understand the present when you bring it in a dialogue with the past. And so he's given many scholarly presentations, just to name a few recent ones at the International Congress on Medieval Studies, at the Byzantine Studies Association of North America, and at the Modern Greek Studies Association. He has a number of scholarly publications in journals such as Theology Today. Most recently, he published an article entitled Visual Arts in Education and the Encyclopedia of the Bible and its Reception. But he also writes in more popular venues. He keeps a very lively blog. He's also published in the Huffington Post, New Criterion, First Things, Books and Culture, and more. And if I just, in closing, I want to give a quote from my colleague Bruce Herman in the art department, who's here today, who knows Matt's work quite well. And Bruce writes, Matthew Milliner is much needed voice in the field of art history with a, I like this, refreshing irreverence of the settled attitudes and opinions of the art world. Quite simply, he is a blast of fresh air, delivering new energy to the larger conversations of our culture, particularly with regard to art, faith, and the public square. Today, he's going to be speaking to us on imaging God the Father and the history of art, and I'm very pleased to turn things over to him. Yeah.
I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for being here. What a day. When the Hudson River School painter Jasper Cropsey first exhibited his paintings of autumns in the Northeast, they didn't believe him. They said, no, autumn can't be that beautiful. And he had to send for pressed leaves from this part of the world to be brought to London to say, yeah, fall really can be that beautiful. So glad to be here for that. I'd like to thank those who have made this lecture possible. and it is given in honor of Walter and Darlene Hansen. I have the privilege of knowing them not only as from their generosity, but from their friendship. And I hope that what I have to say this evening can be an honor to them and to the invisible God to whom their lives so evidently bear witness. Whatever your diagnosis of the current condition of Christianity and public life in the United States, for one thing we can be thankful. To my knowledge, half-naked activists have not yet chainsawed any giant crucifixes. As some of you will know, this is what happened in Kiev last year, as Femin activists protested Russia's decision to convict 3 women connected with a notoriously entitled Russian feminist punk band. But as The Economist pointed out, this wasn't a very well-chosen target. Femin's plan was to protest Putin's connection to Russian Orthodoxy, but the cross they chainsawed was a Catholic one from the Uniate Orthodox Church in communion with the Pope. Secondly, the activists chose a cross that was erected during the Orange Revolution of 2004 and 5, which successfully thwarted government corruption. Thirdly, this act of iconoclasm forced the feminist punk band in question to distance themselves from femin activists, as they did not want to be associated with topless protesters. In other words, this activist stunt failed pretty miserably. But this paper isn't intended to mock Christianity's contemporary assailants. Instead, my aim is actually to let them know that they may have a legitimate target, one that on Christian theological grounds may be worthy of feeling the sharp edge of the iconoclast's hatchet, or as it were, her chainsaw. One example of this kind of image I will be criticizing is right there in Kiev, just blocks from that unfortunate cross, a portrayal in an Orthodox church that should know better of God the Father as an incarnated being. Our activist might have gained more of a hearing had she pointed out that Russian Orthodoxy may indeed be in need of reform, for a major Orthodox monument in Kiev broadcasts an image of God that, according to Orthodox theology, is false. It is false, among other reasons, because such images make men the exclusive bearers of the image of God, not what the first chapter of Genesis teaches. While virtually absent from the entire first millennium of Christianity, around the year 1300, God the Father began to be consistently depicted as a bearded white male, which God the Father is not, never has been, unless he has plans to incarnate that he has not yet divulged to us, never will be. The Christian tradition, at its best, while verbally and very appropriately referring to God as Father, has never suggested that the Father is male. Why then does the Christian visual tradition continue to get away with it? Mormons, for whom God the Father has a material body, have every reason to use this iconography, as do Arians, for whom God the Father is older than Jesus. By depicting God in this way, one could then suggest that Orthodox Christians are visually Arian. Explorations of the intersection of art and theology in recent decades has recognized the possibility of theology and art working in tandem. Images, we've come to understand, communicate theological concepts in their own unique way, not merely as illustrations of previously formulated ideas, but as theology in their own right. But saying art has theological potential is really no more revelatory than saying words have theological potential. As we all know, words fail in their task of exploring the mystery of God as much or more than they succeed, and it is no different with images. Art as theology, then, is not necessarily good news. The word heresy is a strong one, but the damage done by the images I'm discussing arguably could fall under that category, a heresy that has gone unchecked precisely because art's theological potential has not been taken seriously. The most pervasive error one encounters in contemporary arguments about belief in God, writes David Hart in his latest book, is the habit of conceiving of God simply as some very large object or agency within the universe, a being among other beings. Hart is exactly right, but atheists learned that habit, perhaps, from Christians. At the height of the Cold War, Nikita Khrushchev triumphantly made this remark about Yuri Gagarin, the first human to travel in outer space. Gagarin flew into space but didn't see any God there. What was Khrushchev expecting Gagarin would see? Probably this guy, Khrushchev was actually party commander in Kiev. And not surprisingly, this guy wasn't there. You're looking at the God that atheists don't believe in. A quick search of atheist memes will tell you as much, to say nothing of George Burns and Morgan Freeman in Hollywood depictions of God the Father. You may have heard of the flying spaghetti monster, a fake religion known as Pastafarianism, intended to combat creationism. It's probably not coincidence that its chief icon is taken from our chief image of God the Father in the Western tradition. And the caption there, if you can't see it, is touched by his noodly appendage. In order to attempt to convince you of these claims, we'll now navigate three separate academic conversations with as much depth as possible. First, we'll tour medieval metaphysics and discuss its contested contemporary revival. Then we'll shift that conversation to the history of art, a discipline which I'm convinced not only demonstrates crucial shifts in medieval ontology, but might even be the origin of those shifts. And finally, to insert a layer of hope into our discussion, we'll look at some Protestant possibilities. I am a Protestant, and my Catholic and Orthodox brothers and sisters frequently criticize my cherry-picking of the early church tradition. But in this particular instance, it may be evangelicals who can claim visual continuity with early Christianity. Finally, our conclusion will briefly take us back to Russia. Part 1. 2 years ago, my wife and I got a small, very small slice of suburban Chicagoland, having moved to teach at Wheaton College. And thrilled at the prospect of owning a garbage disposal for the first time, I just peeled those potato skins, had a mountain of them, and just shoved them down the drain. I own a garbage disposal. I can do this. And then the sink backed up. Now, I did what I could to get at the clog, hoping that it was near the top. But then I realized with my father-in-law's assistance that the clog was far deeper down. We went into the basement and did what had to be done, and this involved removing the pipe and digging and getting those skins. And I relate this story to you because it all happened as I was rereading Catherine Pickstock's 1997 manifesto of an Anglican theological movement known as Radical Orthodoxy. After writing, what a title, folks, after writing on the liturgical consummation of philosophy, 1997. It struck me as I'm digging into my pipes, trying to artificially intellectualize an unpleasant household chore, that my task was similar to Pickstock's. She, and the Radical Orthodoxy project she is a part of, claims that the chief metaphysical clog in our modern world is far deeper than the rationalism of René Descartes, upon which most of the blame for secularism has hitherto rested. That's what I got. Anyway, Cartesian metaphysics, that's the problem. Well, what she says, no, that's actually a later origin. If only it was that early. Both the Cartesian and the Kantian moves depended upon shifts within Latin scholasticism. Folks, this is a shift that has occurred recently. The metaphysical clog is located, she says, in the thought of the medieval Oxford theologian John Duns Scotus. According to Pickstock, Scotus, because of his misunderstanding of Thomas Aquinas' theology, or maybe his willful misconstrual of it, suggested that our speech about God had to be approached univocally. As Scotus himself put it, unless being implies one univocal intention, theology would simply perish. What the word univocal means, and it's crucial, is that we must speak about God in una voce, one voice. Which is to say, when I say we exist, this room exists, and God exists, I have to mean that in exactly the same way. God differs only in degree. Hence, they're within the same triangle in my diagram. Now, Duns Scotus, why would he do this? He did it for the purposes of clarity. He was worried about equivocal language, which suggests that our language about God and us are separate but equal. That is, they are both equally valid in their own terms, but they do not overlap. It's a position of extreme transcendence. As the medieval Jewish equivocal thinker Maimonides put it, God's names cannot express anything that exists positively in him, only negative language. And fear of this position is what propels Duns Scotus to univocal clarity. Now, any of you familiar with the theology of Thomas Aquinas will know that he subsumes and transcends both of these possibilities. Whether one reads it in the Summa Theological or Summa Contra Gentiles, or for that matter in the vast majority of Orthodox Christian theology that came before Aquinas, this is the tradition of classical Christian metaphysics. Language about God is not univocal or equivocal, but it's both like and unlike, or analogical. Such language permeates the Psalms. Great is the Lord and highly to be praised, reads Psalm 145:3. But the same psalm, in the same verse, reads, his greatness is beyond all searching out. So which is it? You don't have to pick. The early church fathers expand on this notion. For Tertullian, he is beyond our utmost thought. Well, can't say anything about him then. No, though our human faculties conceive of him. Irenaeus puts this analogical position so well. This is one of the litanies that George Hunsinger at Princeton Seminary gave to us. Such a great line. God is light. But this doesn't mean that he moves at 186,282 miles per second, of course, right? He is light, but unlike any light that we know. Perhaps the tradition is most succinctly articulated by Athanasius, who says that God is in essence outside of everything, but is inside everything by his own power, his own choice. He's with us right now. And it is most beautifully expressed, this tradition, by the 6th century Syrian writer who so heavily inspired Thomas Aquinas, Pseudo-Dionysius. This is a quote for the ages. God is at total remove from every condition, movement, life, imagination, conjecture, name, discourse, thought, conception, being, rest, dwelling, unity, limit, infinity, the totality of existence. He is at total remove from every category you could possibly conceive of. And yet, to praise this divinely beneficent providence, you must turn to all of creation. That is why this method is called analogical, because every level of existence is marshaled to analogically describe the hyper-existent God. You want to see a theology of earthworms? You got to go to the Middle Ages. It's really good, too. This is the tradition that Aquinas inherited and refined, and which some claim that Duns Scotus just didn't get. And so, the story goes, was the first step to scaling God down to size. As Brad Gregory, headed here shortly, puts it in his much-discussed tome, metaphysical univocity in combination with Occam's razor opened a path that would lead through deism to Weberian disenchantment and modern atheism. Theologian Stephen Long confirms this, suggesting that univocal or equivocal theology continues to be the inadequate options of the modern world. Equivocity is mirrored in Immanuel Kant, for whom God's noumena is inaccessible to those of us mired in mere phenomena, and radical univocity is expressed in Ludwig Feuerbach, for whom speaking of God is only speaking of man in a loud voice, to say nothing of Heidegger, Deleuze, Badiou, Derrida, each of whom invoke Duns Scotus. If we hope for theological options that transcend theirs, we need to recover the analogical metaphysics of the classical Christian tradition. Now, whatever you think about this increasingly popular narrative, it's important to point out that it is far larger than radical orthodoxy or Brad Gregory. This declinist narrative is a many-headed hydra. David Hart employs a version of it to dismantle the new atheists. It informs Pope Benedict's Regensburg address and can be found in Henri de Lubac. It's what makes Hans Urs von Balthasar so interesting. Additional publications, past and present, all of which are available on the bibliography that I have for you, are equally informed by this medieval perspective, whether or not they pin the blame on Duns Scotus. Now, this all might be considered spillover from the resourcing tradition that gave us the Second Vatican Council. And as I would not be the first to point out, evangelicalism is experiencing its own patristic recovery project. For example, readers of Mark Noll's Jesus Christ in the Life of the Mind will know that Noll adopts the Scotus Declinus narrative, offering that science and religion debates in which evangelicals get needlessly mired depend almost entirely on assumptions about metaphysical univocity, a zero-sum game between God and creation. A young evangelical named Karl Barth famously called the analogy of being, shorthand for the tradition I'm describing, is the invention of the Antichrist. So you might think there'd be a profound Barthian resistance to this approach. But my colleague Keith Johnson has suggested it was actually Barth who was responsible for calling this tradition's representatives to be more Christocentric. As a result, quote, "I have now discontinued the battle against the idol of the analogy of being," writes the mature Barth. "I no longer fire along this front." Perhaps then, there is in all of this something that you might call a metaphysical ecumenism. No longer a triumphant progressive Protestant or Catholic or Orthodox narrative, but a common understanding that with modernism, something in the medieval world got lost that must be recovered. But there have been challenges to the Scotus Declinism that is being addressed, and we've got to address those challenges if we're going to move forward. Folks, let's think about this for a second. Classical Christian metaphysics and the rise of the modern world, can that really, the undermining of classical metaphysics and the birth of where we are now, can it really be pinned on one subtle Oxford theologian? How many people really understood these subtle distinctions anyway? Brad Gregory himself admits univocity belonged to the stratosphere of high intellectual culture and was shared only among a small number of educationally privileged male clerical elites. It was written in a language that only a tiny percentage of the population could understand. So then how could it change the world? One defender of Duns Scotus argues against Pickstock and says that his univocal language is merely intended as a semantic distinction. He assumes this world. And they have the quotes to prove it, because Scotus himself says, God and creatures are nevertheless totally distinct in reality. They share in no reality. His univocal language, then, is perhaps only overlaid on top of classical Christian ontology for the purposes of clarity. This certainly compromises the declinist narrative, and perhaps that's why Charles Taylor says in A Secular Age, I don't think univocity can suffice as the main story behind secularity. And so more strands of this dialogue are necessary if the kind of metaphysical ecumenism I'm talking about is going to emerge. Now, a lot of you in the room might now be like, wait a second, what? This is a bait and switch. I came here for theology and art. And this guy has brought medieval metaphysics into the conversation. Well, see, if you feel that way, you know exactly how I have felt reading the dialogues that I'm describing and saying, why isn't anybody mentioning the art history? I'm convinced, actually, that art is the first place we need to go if we're going to understand this shift. Part 2. Here's our univocal world, in which God, in Pickstock's words, is subordinated to the category of being. Now within it, let's see the sphere of creation as it is illustrated here. Objects, animals, people, this room. And then let's fit God under the same category of being, depicting him, in this case, as one being among others. A very high being, a supreme being even, but a being nonetheless. And what you are looking at is a 1615 engraving that depicts the entire sphere of knowledge and God within that sphere, not outside of it. And what's more, believe it or not, the scholar responsible for this feast of knowledge is John Duns Scotus. Visual evidence that has been ignored indeed suggests there might be something to the Scotus declinist narrative. But the visual evidence goes far deeper than just one manuscript. Let me call your attention to a coincidence. Around the same year that John Duns Scotus was born, 1266, another person was born, whom you may have heard of. In his arena chapel, Giotto de Bondone created a sphere in which God the Father ultimately was depicted. Not Jesus, according to most art historians, but God the Father in majesty in that arena chapel. And while Giotto began with a more translucent depiction of God the Father in a stained glass window, an image that one art historian says shows an indeterminate spatiality of divine presence because it's in a different medium. Later alterations of the arena chapel, however, perhaps by Giusto de Menaboy, gave us an opaque image of God the Father, a God who, as in the manuscript of 1615, shares the same category of being as every other being in Giotto's famous frescoes. And unlike nuanced metaphysical debates, such images are not limited to a clerical elite. Everybody saw them. In other words, it wasn't Duns Scotus with the pen, but the late medieval artist with the paintbrush that desacralized the modern world. Now, it's of course a lot more complicated than a board game. There are many strands involved, but I still think there's something to be said for the artistic view on this perspective. A shift from, this is a close-up of Giotto's blue, a shift from, in Jean-Luc Marion's words, an image that returns all glory to the invisible, the icon, to the idol, the widow of all holiness, which shuts up the gaze in its finite origins. A world that, according to many, we're still in if we are instinctually secular. Now, those who make the case for the break from analogical to univocal metaphysics have to start way back, and so must we. So let's engage in a very brief iconographical history of depictions of God the Father. The trope of God's invisibility was an overriding feature of early Christian apologists. Hence, they avoided images of the Father, choosing instead to depict the hetimasia, an empty throne, which was used in pagan iconography as well, or simply the divine hand. Here you see the divine hand reaching down, an undepictable Father reaching to pick up a depictable Christ. Such an approach had the advantage of both distinguishing Christians from pagans, they did not use images of God, and offering continuity with Judaism. They did not violate the command against graven images. Now, there are, of course, exceptions to this rule. The mid-4th century Trinity sarcophagus, for example, is called that because it depicts the Trinity in the act of making Eve. But as the Orthodox theologian Stephen Bigham so helpfully explains, the theological environment in which this seed germinated was so hostile as to not allow the plant to survive. And so, such images almost completely disappeared, and not without resistance. John Cassian tells us that when the 5th century bishop Theophilus of Alexandria taught that God the Father is incorporeal, simple Egyptian monks fled out of the monasteries and demanded that he be put to death. This is known as the anthropomorphite controversy. And when finally one of these monks named Serapion yielded to the teaching that the first person of the Trinity is bodiless, the brothers rejoiced and prayed for him, but he then cried out, "They've taken my God away from me. I have no one to hold on to, and I don't know whom to adore or to address." It can be difficult to mature in your Christian faith, to extract ourselves from false images of God. But Serapion and the rest of the early Christian tradition were rarely attracted to the easy road. And so, as Robin Jensen puts it, at the end of the 4th century, the anthropomorphic pictorial representation of God the Father goes underground. Condemnations of depictions of God the Father are routine in the first millennium of Christianity, East and West. And to drive this home, consider one last example of our proponent of classical Christian metaphysics, the great defender of icons, John of Damascus. I do not depict the invisible Trinity, the invisible divinity, he tells us, but I depict God made visible in the flesh. John's defense of icons of Christ is premised upon his refusal to depict the Father, of whom the depictable Christ is the perfect image, and of whom all of creation offers a distant image. Following Pseudo-Dionysius, John's perspective is also analogical, for we cannot behold the bodiless without using shapes that bear some analogy to us. Hence, John of Damascus marshals an entire universe of images. Everything in our terms, from stars to atoms, all of which indicate God's glory without capturing it. And here you see what I was trying to get at with PowerPoint's garish yellow. God, you see, is in the gold. This is the dome dedicated to creation in the Byzantine-inspired Cathedral of San Marco in Venice. Because gold is both luminous and opaque at the same time, its radiance symbolizes divine glory. Gold adequately expressed the divine impenetrable light, as Leonid Uspensky put it. This was the visual grammar of early Christianity. But later Christians could not live on symbolism alone. Now, finding the exact moment where images of the Father returned is difficult, for images that survive art historically aren't necessarily the best or most influential examples. One remarkably early instance can be found in this Byzantine manuscript from a scribe who should have known better. But the watershed, as I've already pointed out, was the year 1300. And Duns Scotus's England offers examples of images of the Father in great abundance, images termed the Throne of Grace. This is one prominently located in our National Gallery in D.C. Look how the panel above St. Francis's famous San Damiano crucifix is changed to a literal depiction of the Father after the year 1300. Would we have had another Francis without these? Observing these images around 1300, writes Adolphe Napoleon Didron, is like being present at a birth. And an ugly birth it was. All these singular iconographic changes, this is a quote from him, were made in the course of the 14th century, but by about 1360, the idea of paternity and filiation became irrevocably fixed and shows itself more and more clearly down to our time. From this time forward, God the Father appears to have a face and figure peculiarly his own, and of which he is never after deprived. The theological idea succumbs, overpowered by historical truth and human realities. A century of art history has not improved upon Didron's description. Thomas Merton once said that if there is any proof of the mercy of God, it is the toleration he has of the pictures made of him. If you've ever had a bad picture of yourself on Facebook go viral, don't worry, God can relate. That's what's happening, okay? Proving there are images of the Father at this time in European history is like proving there are fish in a well-stocked river. Just drop your rod in anywhere in the 15th century, and up they come. Masaccio's famous Trinity is passionately defended by Dominican art historians today, but I'm not sure that depicting God bound by the laws of perspective should be considered a compliment. The Annunciation, because of these depictions, is subject to the very criticism made about the doctrine by feminists like Mary Daly. It's as if a male God is having sex with Mary. While the Gospel of Luke doesn't even remotely suggest that, Fra Filippo Lippi's image does. This is serious. There's reason there's command against these things. And at the creation of Adam, in Ghiberti's famous, and I admit staggeringly beautiful, Gates of Paradise, it is only the male Adam who resembles the male God. So unlike the Genesis narrative, which reads, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. And in the original, not in a later revision, male and female, he created them. Now one might think, come on, Milliner, these are symbolic. Have some imagination. It's an attempt to suggest that God is personal. Many have defended these even today. Don't take it so literally, they say. No one's really suggesting that God the Father entered Mary's womb and became incarnate, or are they? You're looking at an image of a Vierge ouvrante that opens to reveal exactly that. But can all this really be connected to univocity, as I'm attempting to suggest? Don't take my word for it. Take John Paul II's. Commenting on the most famous of these instances, the Sistine Chapel, John Paul II is clear. With great daring, Michelangelo even transferred this visible and corporeal beauty to the Creator himself. Would this not be blasphemy? The majesty of the Creator, like that of the judge, speaks of divine grandeur, a moving and univocal word. For the record, I am not suggesting, by the way, that we melt down Ghiberti's doors and whitewash the Sistine Chapel. All I'm suggesting is that we read what Michelangelo himself said about these images. So, the affectionate fantasy that made art an idol and sovereign to me, I now clearly see was laden with error, he says in a late sonnet. And as art historian Alexander Nagel has shown, the late Michelangelo returned, as perhaps we should, to the art of the early church. And so, this is a rough map of the iconographical history of depictions of God the Father in the West, the loss of medieval mystery. Lord, show us the Father, and we shall be satisfied, Philip asks Christ in John 14. The history of art has asked the same question, forgetting, as did Philip, that whoever has seen me, Jesus, has seen the Father. But was anything done about it? Interestingly, most attempts were thwarted. The Council of Trent was divided on the issue, and its refusal to rule on the matter of images of the Father led to several smaller councils attempting to interpret that decision. Occasionally, popes intervened to curb the most dangerous abuses, such as images of the so-called monstrous Trinity, a three-headed God, condemned in 1628 by Pope Urban VIII. But such images persisted. The Augustinian theologian Jean Hessels was retroactively condemned by the Holy Office in 1690 for arguing against images of the Father. One scholar who is sympathetic to Catholicism pointed out that in so disapproving Hessels, the Holy Office condemned the position of Augustine himself. Because images of the Father and Trinity persisted, over a century later, Pope Benedict XIV issued a document in 1745, and in it, monstrous trinities were again prohibited, as were the throne of grace within the womb of Mary. But anthropomorphisms were generally tolerated, and images of the Father as Ancient of Days were specifically approved. The explanation for this approval, according to one commentator, is that the Catholic Church, quote, did not want to make high demands to the imaginative powers of the simple faithful. And therefore, images of the Father should be permitted. But these unapproved images didn't go away, and the confusion caused by them led to the Council of Pistoia, an attempt to condemn images that represented the Trinity. But rather than being permitted to go ahead with this reform, the council itself was condemned in 1794 by Pope Pius VI. Again, the opinion that the Holy Trinity or the Father should not be represented was itself suppressed, because you could be considered Jansenist if you did that, a pseudo-Protestant position. What about the East, though? Shouldn't they be considered a comparatively pure visual tradition? And as we've seen, there were Orthodox slips on this issue long before the West caught on. And here's another homegrown Russian icon of the Father. The icon of the Trinity by Andrei Rublev is a special case because it is a brilliantly indirect image of the Trinity in the guise of the angelic visitors to Mamre. And the Stoglov Council, from the Russian word for 100, approved this image in its 100 chapters, but attempted to stop direct images of the Father, because divinity is hidden to all painters. But not even 5 years later, a different council in Moscow approved images of the Father based on their historical precedent. Over a century later, the Great Council of Moscow tried to stem such confusion by condemning these images again, but the same council permitted God the Father to be depicted with gray hair as he is in Revelation. But that's Christ in Revelation. Further attempts to curb images of the Father, there was one in 1722, are just more evidence that they kept being made. Here is one that awaits you when you visit Mount Athos today. In effect, the Western Church refuses, and the Eastern Church has difficulty inhibiting the visual univocity evoked by images of God the Father. And the common denominator in both, it seems to me, is fear of Protestantism. As one 18th century writer put it, westernized images must continue to be made in Russia in order to strengthen the faith and keep it from Lutherans, Calvinists, and other iconoclasts. As with Mariology, Protestants underdoing it paves the way for Catholic and Orthodox Christians overdoing it. And maybe that's one of the laws of church division. We are bound to get it wrong until we are bound to one another again. And it's time now to give that Protestant underdoing a closer look. By reframing the question of univocal metaphysics around images of God the Father, my aim has been to further support the declinist narrative that informs Brad Gregory's book and the entire ressourcement tradition that it represents. But one consequence of this reframing is that if univocity, seeing God and creatures under the same category, really is a visual phenomenon as well, then Protestants, on this particular issue at least, come out on top. The Reformation may have been, in the words of Eamon Duffy, a stripping away of familiar and beloved observances, the destruction of a vast and resonant world of symbols, but it was also a removal of images that were obstructing that vast and resonant world. Now, please don't misunderstand me. This is not Protestant triumphalism. Calvinists obviously went too far in their removal of images. But it is the placement of Calvin's tirade against images in the Institutes that makes it so insightful. His polemic falls into the section on God the Father. And it could have been lifted right from the playbook of John of Damascus. God's majesty is sullied by an unfitting and absurd fiction when he who is incorporeal is made to resemble corporeal matter, when he who is invisible is made to resemble a visible image. This truly is a return to the early Christian understanding. Now, Protestants were no more universally consistent on this issue than Catholics or Orthodox were. Here is one print showing God the Father that, according to one art historian, happily circulated amongst both Roman Catholics and Lutherans. One has to admit that. But Neo-Augustinian Protestants certainly had the better record in avoiding such images. Here is a print that was made by the same artist for both Catholic and Protestant communities. But in this case, when it circulated among Protestants, necessary adjustments were made. Yes, Calvinist churches were bare, but as numerous studies have made clear in the past decades, they certainly had an aesthetic. And what I'd like to add to this common understanding is that although the iconography of God the Father may have, for the most part, been absent in such whitewashed churches, the motif found other outlets. This is the naked, bare church of St. Bavo's in Haarlem. And here, in Jacob van Ruysdael's painting of the same time, you are looking at the same church. And it is the sky here that evokes God the Father's infinitude and transcendence. John Walford has explained that contemplative delight in the visible world was instilled into Ruysdael by the influential Confession of Faith and Catechism of the Netherlands Reformed churches. Parts of Joseph Leo Kerner's scholarship continue this possibility. Kerner saw the German Protestant painter Caspar David Friedrich's landscapes as venues in which God submitted to a Hebraic iconoclasm born perhaps from the artist's own Protestant spirituality, shown in his absence as the image of his consequences. Books such as Timothy Gorange's Earthly Visions or the magisterial overview offered by Bakker in Landscape and Religion, this book just came out, take this idea further and mean that such a perspective no longer has to be considered unusual. For so many decades, art historians saw landscapes as the harbingers of secularism, artists bravely casting off the shackles of religious ideology. But Gorange and Bakker convincingly show that, especially in the Protestant Netherlandish tradition, the traditional Christian worldview remained largely intact, despite the bold assertions made by Descartes and Spinoza and the enormous interest taken in science. And so the origin of landscape painting, a perennial question in my discipline, might be more clearly discerned in the cloister's famous Life of St. Augustine. In the upper right, we see Augustine wondering if he could fathom the Father. He runs into a child who is trying to do something similar, trying to put the entire ocean into a tiny hole he had made with his thumb. It's impossible. The Father's vastness is instead evoked by the land and seascape beyond the saint. This is the tradition that continued in our Dutch painters and which was the chief influence in New Amsterdam, leading to our own Hudson River School. Consider this view of Western Massachusetts, which became one of America's most famous paintings, and which appropriately culminates now the great hallway of the American wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You can see it all the way through those rooms. It's an incredible view. It beckons you in. Cole's view from Mount Holyoke is not merely a critique of Jacksonian deforestation, though it is that. The reason deforestation is bad is because the landscape reflects the glory of God. We're going to zero in. And it reflects that glory quite literally. Inscribed in the landscape may be the Hebrew words Noah, when seen from the human vantage point, and the Hebrew words Shaddai, when seen from the divine vantage point above. This is the painting of the great Hudson River School, and it is betraying this perspective that I'm suggesting. It's the most direct evidence I can imagine for landscape glory evoking the first person of the Trinity. And while such an interpretation may have been seen as quirky for a previous generation, the studies I'm referring to and the general exhaustion of the Kantian category of the sublime make such an interpretation defensible again. I like to go back to the origin of that word sublime in the Latin Vulgate, sublimitas, talking about God's longitudinal and latitudinal love. Seeing the land in this way would not have surprised Jonathan Edwards, who pastored not far from this precise location, and who would have seen this very site. All the beauty to be found throughout the whole creation is but the reflection of the diffused beams of that being who hath an infinite fullness of brightness and glory. And that very same tradition was not buried. It was revivified by John Ruskin, whose writings were enormously influential to 19th century American painters. The expression of infinity and distance is of all visible things the least material, the least finite, the most typical of the nature of God, the most suggestive of the glory of his dwelling place. That's analogical metaphysics, if there ever was such a thing, from an evangelical art historian in the 19th century. And this is the Protestant iconography of the first person of the Trinity, an interesting complement, to say the least, to Dennis Dutton's suggestion that the reason we love landscapes is because we were conditioned in the Pleistocene period 1.6 million years ago to see in such landscapes prospects for refuge and food. This Protestant, but not exclusively Protestant, tradition of depicting the infinite and undepictable Father endures. Each Sunday, I worship at a church in Wheaton, Illinois, that has been enhanced in exactly this way. The accomplished landscape painter Joel Shi Slee, when faced with the prospect of turning a suburban white box into something more fitting as an outpost for the kingdom of God on earth, did a pretty good job of it. He indicated the glory of God hovering above with Byzantine gold, or at least as close as you can get to it without a Doge's budget. All of creation in this painting, like the creation at San Marcos, is being lifted up into God's glory, as are we, thanks to the cleansing waters of baptism that we are reminded of as we walk under the waters that proceed from the rock, who is Christ. This is a landscape that depicts God the Father. Another colleague of mine, Jeremy Botts, has used video art to communicate the same notion. At his Mennonite church in Lombard, Illinois, he played this film during a service, of which I am showing you a very brief excerpt. The horizon and roar of Lake Michigan evoke God's infinitude, And over the span of this several-minute-long video can be seen the slightest suggestion of a face, not of God the Father, but of his Son. And you can barely make out the hint of the Shroud of Turin. The Protestant image of God the Father endures, except when it doesn't. In a recent book, I've already mentioned that so wonderfully disseminates the medieval tradition to evangelicals. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. Boyer and Hall rightfully insist that Christians, from the very beginning, have insisted that God the Father is not one thing among others, the God of whom no image may be made, since every image falls short. Except, as you'll notice, in the upper right-hand corner of the book, just such an image of God the Father has been reproduced. But the good news is, the iconoclasts at Amazon have fixed it. So now the book is okay. All right. And it really is wonderful. And we should fix those images too. So I began with Russian feminist protests, and I'll end with them as well. The stunt that set off our feminine activists in Kiev was due to the conviction resulting from these women staging a punk protest prayer inside Russia's Trinity Cathedral in Moscow. These women claim they are not enemies of Christianity, but are merely critiquing Orthodoxy's political alliance with Putin. And in the endless commentary upon this event, no one that I have read has pointed out that if these activists, who prayed that Mary would become a feminist, missed something, it was by not looking up. Were they to do so, they would have found much for their case. To point out that Orthodoxy needs reform, they could gaze upwards where an unauthorized image of God the Father in Moscow's most prominent cathedral endures. And there can be no pinning the blame on Western influence here, because after the original 1860 building was destroyed by Stalin in 1931, it was reconstructed exactly as it had been in the 1990s, making it Orthodoxy's tallest cathedral. Such a depiction might be further evidence to suggest that these silenced women, two of which are still in prison, may have been onto something. As one of their defense attorneys put it, there hasn't been a blasphemy trial in Russia in 95 years, not since 1917. In 2012, time turned back to the Middle Ages. If only it had. Thank you.